Hi, this is Ray Grant. I'm sitting here. It's 12:45 a.m. Sunday, November 6th here in Pittsburgh. I just did a video with Ned DeHaan on his channel on Saturday morning from about 9 o'clock to noon. So I think it's a 3 hour video. I don't know if Ned's going to post all of it. As a result of doing that video, I've decided that instead of doing any complex video where I walk the reader through the Zodiac events, I'm just going to do a very informal walkthrough. I'm going to do Riverside, then Lake Herman Road, then Lake Berryessa, Presidio Heights, and so forth, and talk about a few other things in the Zodiac case. But I'm just going to do it informally because I'm not sure how much actual interest there is out there. People don't seem to be particularly interested in the actual evidence in the case, and it's after doing the 3 hours with Ned, I decided let me just do the basics here in a video, and if people want more of it, maybe I'll do something a little bit more intense than what I'm doing now. But this is your basic walkthrough, so I'm going to start with Riverside and then move on to the other episodes. We start out with Cheri Bates. It's Sunday, October 30th, 1966, the day she was murdered. She goes to Catholic Mass at St. Catherine's Church at 8 a.m. At 9 a.m., she and her dad go to Sandy's restaurant in the Hardman Center, which is around the corner from her house, which was at 4195 Via San Jose. They have breakfast at Sandy's, and there's a lady waiting for her French toast order when they walk in. And Sherry and her dad are able to place their orders, get their food, eat their food, and walk out the door before the lady gets her French toast. And throughout the time that was going on, according to her dad, Sherry was teasing the French toast lady unmercifully. And her dad says that the French toast lady was getting pretty ticked off by the time they left. One of the things that this demonstrates is that Cheri Bates was outgoing. She had a lot of friends. She was friendly. There's been this suggestion that she was shy. I don't think she was shy. She may have been shy when she was around her dad because I don't know. Her dad was in the defense industry. Maybe everything was very hush hush. When he was talking to his colleagues, but she was appeared to be quite popular. She was very high on people's radar screens. So the point being, Cheri Bates was outgoing. She wasn't somebody who was likely to be inside a library for 3 hours without people noticing her and without her calling attention to herself at some point. Her dad went to the beach for the day with a friend of his. Sherry stayed home. The last time he saw his daughter, she was listening to music on a record player. At 3:45 p.m., Sherry called her friend Stephanie Gutman and asked her if she wanted to go to the RCC library that night and to take out books and to study a little. And Stephanie declined. It's important to realize that you don't invite a friend of yours if you're just going someplace to pick things up. If she were just going to the library to run in and take books out and run back out again, you wouldn't invite a friend for that. She invited her friend because she expected to be at the library that evening for some time. And also, the fact that she was inviting her friend means that she wasn't necessarily going to stick her nose in a book and being communicative for 3 hours. I mean, she clearly intended to socialize a little bit. I mean, if she's asking a friend to come along. Stephanie declined the invitation. Then between 4 and 5 p.m., Cheri made herself supper, which consisted of roast beef, vegetables, and a glass of milk. She cooked her supper. She ate it. Uh, she, she may have put leftovers in the fridge. She put washed dishes in the dish rack. And she left the house between or just before 5 p.m. Now, it's important to realize if Cheri Bates's intent was just to go to the library, take books out, and drive back home and study in her bedroom, then she could have done that at 4 o'clock. The moment that Stephanie declined the invitation, Cheri could have gone out to her car, gotten in, driven the 10-15 minute drive to RCC, got into the library, taken books out, driven back home. The library was still open between 4 and 5 p.m. It closed at 5 p.m. for an hour between 5 and 6. That was the dinner break or supper break. Okay. So again, if it was the fact that Cheri Bates made herself supper before she headed out means that she expected to be at the library for at least a little while that night, and to spend some time presumably not just getting books but also studying. So Cheri leaves her house just before 5 p.m. Her dad meanwhile has come back from the beach. He tries to call his own house at 5 o'clock and again at 5 p.m. and gets a busy signal both times. In 1966, I was 15 and a half at the time. If you're calling from a landline, you're not calling from one of these. And as a result of that, there's no call waiting or call forwarding or voicemail, okay? And most people didn't have answering machines hooked up to their phones. Answering machines were common in business, not so much in residences, although there are people who had them, but they just weren't common. So Joseph Bates gets a busy signal at 5 o'clock and at 5:15 p.m. He then drives to his own house, presumably to ask Cheri if she wants to have supper at his friend's house. And when he gets to his own house, circa 5:20 p.m., he sees that Cheri has made supper for herself. And as I said, he either sees leftovers or he sees dishes in the dish rack. There's also a note that Cheri had left for him, which says, "Dad went to RCC Library." So then the phone rings, and it's Stephanie Gutman calling. And Joseph takes a message. The fact that Stephanie Gutman called right around the time when Joseph got home suggests that Stephanie Gutman was probably the person who engaged the line at 5 o'clock and at 5:15 p.m. when Joseph attempted to call. So presumably she had been calling all along, trying to get in touch with Cheri. And then he answered the phone, and it was Stephanie. So Joseph then left a note for Cheri, and he taped it to the refrigerator. And then he went back outside and got in his car and drove back to his friend's house, and presumably had supper. And then they spent the evening watching TV. And he eventually got back to his house after midnight and found that the note that he had left for Cheri was undisturbed. In the meantime, Cheri Bates is driven to RCC. That would have taken 10 to 15 minutes. So presumably she gets there maybe 5:15 p.m. She is seen sitting outside the quad building by another student, as she is seen writing in her notepad right around 5:30 p.m. Cheri then called her coworker at the Riverside National Bank, Donna, and asked her if she had seen her bibliography. And presumably, because she was seen at RCC, Cheri called Donna from a payphone at RCC. In 1966, again, people didn't have these in their pockets, so Payphones were everywhere. They were any place where you had public buildings, you also had payphones. So she called Donna from the payphone, and Donna said she hadn't seen Cheri's bibliography. Cheri said, "Well, now I'll have to start all over on my note cards." And so when Cheri and Donna hung up, it would have been 5:35, 5:40. The library wasn't going to open again until 6 p.m. So what do you do if you don't have your bibliography and you want to use it to find books? What you have to remember is in 1966, when I was a student at the University of Pittsburgh in 1969 through 1972, bibliography was a list of books for a course that the teacher gave you, usually at the beginning of the semester, and it contained the titles of books that were assigned reading assignments for the course. And generally, what would happen is, well, what would always happen is you would take the bibliography, you would go into the library. Libraries didn't have computers back then. They had these things called card catalogs, and you would look up the book title or the author of the book's name in the card catalog. That would tell you what the classification number for the book was, and which meant you could then find it on the shelves. You could go and get the book, or if the book was a reference copy, which happened very often because there would be a big demand for, if there were whatever, let's say there were 20 students in a course, all 20 students would be getting the same bibliography, and there would be a significant amount of demand for those books. So what they often did was they had the books at the library as reference copies, where you could go to the library and read the book and take notes or what have you at the library, but you couldn't actually take out the reference copy. The reference copy stayed at the library. So uh, so Cheri Bates needed her bibliography, and the fact that she called Donna tells us that she needed her bibliography to continue studying. So what do you do if you're in that situation and the library's not going to open for 20 minutes? Well, logically, you would just drive back to your house and look for the bibliography there. I believe Cheri Bates got into her car again, maybe 5:40, drove back to her house. Let's say it took her 15 minutes to get there, so now it's 5:55. She walks in the front door of her house. Remember, her dad has been there and left since Cheri herself left, but Cheri doesn't know that. Cheri walks through the front door. She walks all the way back to her bedroom, which is where she did her studying. She must have found the bibliography and I guess her note cards, and walks back out of the bedroom, back out of the front door, and gets back in her car and drives back to RCC. When Joseph Bates came home after midnight, he found the note that he had left taped to the refrigerator undisturbed. The reason for this was that Cheri Bates, once she found her bibliography in her bedroom, wouldn't have had any reason to look for it in the kitchen anywhere because she just found it. So that explains why the Joseph's note went undisturbed. Cheri walks back out the front door of her house, gets in her car, drives back to RCC, leaves the house maybe 6 p.m. Now, a friend of Cheri's saw her driving on Magnolia Avenue at 6:10 p.m. This was in the general area of the Magnolia Center, which would have been maybe 1/3 of the way to RCC. The friend waved to Cheri, but apparently Cheri didn't see her. She didn't wave back. Then a March Air Force Base man who was in the rear of his apartment house, which was the Shelley Lynn Apartments at 4710 Magnolia, have since been demolished, and there are school buildings there. He was in the back alley of his of his apartment house, where his apartment house was, the rear of it, and he saw a blonde in a lime green VW Beetle. In other words, Cheri's car and Cheri. He saw them driving up the alley behind the apartment house, and the car was followed closely by another car. One of the things that this suggests is that Cheri Bates may have been taking evasive action to get rid of whoever was following her, because ordinarily what she would have done is she would have driven along Magnolia Avenue, come to the intersection of Terracina where the light was, and made a right there. Okay. The fact that instead of doing that, Cheri Bates made a right one block before then on Fairfax and then drove up the alley is suggestive of the possibility that Cheri had become aware that she was being tailed by somebody and was trying to take evasive action. Now, what I have her doing in my novel is as soon as she gets to the top of the alley, she does the next thing that somebody might do in that situation, which is she pulls over. In other words, to let the person who is tailing her drive past her. Instead of doing that, he pulls in behind her, gets out, and abducts her, very likely at gunpoint. And she had to go in. I believe she then had to go into the car with her abductors, and her car was eventually found in front of the library. But if you abduct somebody, it means you have control over not only them, but of their vehicles. So I think her car may have been moved from whatever, like a block west of the library to the front of the library, possibly even after they killed Cheri, which happened like around 10:30 p.m. So Cheri Bates is the last time, regardless of what happened to her, the last time she is seen is at about 6:15 p.m. that night, and she's never seen again until her body is found the next morning at 6:30 a.m. Riverside PD did a reconstruction 2 weeks after the date of the murder, which was on the reconstruction was on Sunday, November 13th, 1966. It took place between the hours of 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. Everyone who was at the library that night, there was 65 people, or 29 fraternity pledges who were outside in front of the Quad building. There were 33 students who used the library that night. There were 2 librarians and there was 1 student staffer at the library. So in total, there were 65 people who were in the vicinity such that they would have seen Cheri, or might have seen Cheri if she had been there. When Riverside PD did the reconstruction, they had everybody park in the same spaces they'd parked in that night. They had everybody sit in the same seats that they sat inside the library. They took charts of the parking spaces. They made diagrams of where everybody was sitting. They had everybody go through the exact same motions they had 2 weeks earlier, do exactly what they did. They had everybody wear the same clothes. To jog people's memories, they even had a co-ed who resembled Cheri dress up in clothes that were similar to what she wore that night. The student staff member said that he thought he might have seen Cheri that night, but it might be some other night that he was thinking about. No one else who was in the library or outside the library said that they saw Cheri that night. The police took fingerprints of all the males. They took a lock of hair of each of the males. Nobody saw Cheri outside in front of the library trying to start her car. Cheri's body was found the next day. One of the things that people have to remember about Cheri Bates, there have been basically since I've raised these issues on the internet. I don't think they were ever raised before I raised them. Is that people have come up with this idea that Cheri could have been inside the library that night and just not be noticed and kept to herself or what have you, and been in some back part of the library, and that's why she wasn't noticed. That's very well, it's impossible for me to believe. First of all, you have the fact that Cheri was very outgoing. She had friends of hers who were in the library that night. They didn't see her. She didn't come up to them. Um, when Cheri Bates was in the restaurant that morning, she had teased the lady. The people from the time that Cheri Bates called Stephanie Gutman, which was at 3:45 p.m., to uh, the last time she was seen, which was at 6:15 p.m. Cheri Bates had 7 different encounters with people of one kind or another. She called Stephanie on the phone at 3:45 p.m. A friend of Cheri's drove past her house and saw her VW Beetle parked in front of the house at 4:30 p.m. Cheri left a note for her dad that said, "Dad went to RCC Library." Cheri was seen outside the Quad building circa 5:30 by another student. Cheri made a phone call to her coworker and friend Donna shortly after that, after 5:30. I assume what happened was when Cheri was writing in her notepad and looking around, one of the things this tells us is that she had not looked at her course materials during when she was at her house. She didn't actually look through them until she was sitting outside the library. So that's 5. She was then seen by her friend driving toward RCC on Magnolia Avenue in the neighborhood of the Magnolia Center at 6:10. She was seen by the March Air Force Base man circa right around 6:15 p.m. So Cheri Bates had 7 different encounters with people in the 2.5 hours prior to the last time that she was seen, which was 6:15 p.m. And when all of those encounters happened, she was either by herself inside her house, or she was in her car, or she was sitting outside the Quad building. But she was alone. She wasn't with other people. So the question is, how could she have 7 different encounters where she was noticed by other people, and then be inside a 35 by 70-foot library for 3 hours and not be noticed by anybody, and then be out in front of the library for another hour and a half trying to start her car without being noticed by anybody? I think the answer to that is that Cheri Bates was abducted circa 6:15 p.m. that night. We also have the evidence that Cheri Bates's car was left with the windows down, the doors unlocked, books and her notepad on the front passenger seat, and the key to her car was still in the ignition. Now, as I told Ned, I've been driving for 50 years. I don't think I've ever walked away from a car that I owned or that I had rented or what have you with the key still in the ignition. Okay, it's basically asking for the car to get stolen. Um, the other problem with Dennis Highland, who is her fiance, has said that Cheri Bates had bought her car with her own money from working at the Riverside National Bank and doing typing work at Riverside City College. And she was very proud of the car. She would never have left the car in that condition. She would have locked it up first before she walked away from it. So that suggests that when she did leave her car, it was involuntary. She didn't do it on her own. On her own. The other problem is Cheri Bates ate between 4 and 5 p.m. that night. When she was autopsied the following day, the autopsy took place between 11 a.m. and I think 1:42 p.m. at the Atchison Mortuary, which was actually down the street from her house. The medical examiner found roast beef and vegetables and milk inside her stomach, or a dairy product inside her stomach. There were 100 milliliters of food still in her stomach. That's 3.4 ounces of food that was still found in her stomach. The two ear witnesses heard a scream after the library closed at around 10:30 that night, which was an hour and a half after the library closed. Assuming that that's when Cheri Bates was murdered, and the medical examiner's estimate from her liver temperature was that Cheri was murdered sometime between 9:23 p.m. and 12:23 a.m. That night, because the liver temperature was taken actually at 9:23 a.m. The following day, so it was between 9 and 12 hours. She had been murdered between 9 and 12 hours prior to the temperature being taken. So if she was murdered at 10:30, and again, most people who post about the Zodiac killer case online weren't alive when it happened. I was alive. I was 15 and a half in 1966. It was the first year of daylight savings time. And you were reminded, people listened to the radio all the time. We used to have our TV set would be on in the living room, and then we'd have a radio on either in the dining room or in the kitchen. So you were listening to radio all the time, and on the radio they were constantly reminding you, "Hey, don't forget to set your clocks back tonight. On Saturday and over the weekend." So that the likelihood that somebody was wrong about the time because they forgot to set their clocks back in 1966 is very small, because as they said, you were reminded of it all the time. And also, if it were 10:30 already on Sunday night, that means whoever had forgotten to set their clocks back hadn't noticed the entire day that they had the wrong time on their clocks or on their watches. So I think we can be reasonably sure, particularly since there were two ear witnesses who both said that the scream came at approximately 10:30 that night, that Cheri Bates was murdered at least 5.5 hours after she ate supper, and yet 3.4 ounces of the supper she ate, somewhere between a third and a half of what she ate was still in her stomach. Cheri Bates was 18. I don't know that she didn't have some sort of gastrointestinal issue, but she was 18 years old. She had been a cheerleader at Ramona High. She figured to have a very high metabolism, so she shouldn't have had anything in her stomach. And that she had a third to a half of her supper still in her stomach 5.5 hours afterward, after she ate, is suggestive that she was in a very high stress situation. Most people believe that Cheri Bates was stabbed to death in a dark alley by a knife wielding, maybe rejected suitor who had made a frontal attack. Well, her stomach says that she was experiencing very high stress and probably in fear for her life for several hours on Sunday night before she was actually murdered. Okay, that's why there was the fight or flight response dictates that the energy of the person is sent to other areas of the body, and it isn't used up in digestion, and it tends to slow the digestive process, sometimes very dramatically. So I think it is reasonable to assume that Cheri Bates was abducted prior to her murder, and the abduction probably took place around 6:15 p.m. that night. That means several things. It means that she was abducted, she was held someplace for a period of more than 4 hours. She was then brought back to the alley, which was just west of the Quad building, and murdered there. It also means that that her abductors took her student card and her student ID, went into the library and charged 3 books. Again, a student who had been issued a bibliography would not just go into the library and just take 3 books off the shelf, even if it was on the subject of the course. What you needed to do with the information from the bibliography is take the specific books which were recommended by the professor in the course. So this means that her abductors did that. Her abductors went into the library, took 3 books out just to place her in the library to cover up the abduction. Uh, the um, the newspapers the day after the reconstruction said that Cheri was seen with, or that 2 people were seen inside the library. The first edition of the newspaper the next day said police are looking for 2 people, a young man in his 20s with a beard, and a woman who were inside the RCC library on Sunday night. Because those 2 people didn't return, they were seen talking to each other, and they didn't talk to anybody else. They didn't take any books out themselves because that would have identified them. So it is reasonable to assume that Cheri Bates was abducted. It is reasonable to assume she never made it to the library that night, and her abductors went into the library and charged books out on her student ID in order to place her in the library. The day after she was murdered, she was autopsied. Uh, I've been saying this since I'm blue in the face. It doesn't seem to have much of an effect. If you look at Cheri Bates's autopsy, it is absolutely not consistent with a frontal knife attack in a pitch dark alley. She has small, very small, shallow wounds on her fingers, on her face, in the upper part of her torso. She doesn't have wounds where you would expect her to have wounds. If she had experienced a frontal assault in a pitch dark alley, she had no. Generally speaking, an assailant with a knife is going to approach the victim and make underhanded thrust. Cheri Bates had no wounds in her abdomen. All her wounds were in her the upper part of her torso, and she also didn't have any defensive wounds. There are no wounds on her. There are no cuts or bruises on the front of her forearms, which you would expect to see. There were no cuts or wounds on the palms of her hand. Again, those are all areas that would be typical to have wounds in a frontal knife attack. I believe what actually happened was Cheri Bates was abducted the night she was murdered. She was held by herself, maybe inside a car in a docking area behind one of the campus buildings. She was then taken to the alley, which was just to the west of the quad building, around 10:30 or so. She was walked down the alley by 2 men. I think one of them, when they got about halfway down the alley, one of them grabbed Cheri in a bear hug maneuver, which would cause petechial hemorrhaging in the forehead. She wasn't choked because there was no petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes. But if you are bear hugged, you will get petechial hemorrhaging in like the forehead and scalp area, and that's what she had. So she was grabbed frontally by one of her assailants, such that her arms were pinned to her sides. And while that was going on, her actual killer cut her throat, made at least 7 transections of her throat, cutting the carotid artery and the jugular jugular vein or veins, and I think what happened was, as soon as the man in front of her grabbed her, Cheri realized that she was about to be murdered, and that's why she started screaming. And her screams became muffled because of the fact that her throat was being cut. It would be an extremely unusual wound pattern for someone who is attacked in a pitch dark alley by a single assailant wielding a knife, to have seven very thorough transections of at least seven transections of the throat area, and minimal wounds to the rest of the body. She wasn't punched, she wasn't kicked, she didn't have any blood on her teeth, she didn't have bruising suggestive of any kind of disabling blow. Okay. It is more accurate to say that the murder of Cheri Bates was clinical. It was a hit basically, but it was performed very clinically and with a minimum amount of of brutality. It was not a rage filled assault. It was the opposite of that. It was extremely cold blooded. And two things about the condition that Cheri was found in. The first being the ground was plowed up where she had been assaulted. Basically, what happens is if your arms are pinned to your side and someone is cutting your throat, what is going to move? Obviously, the one part of your body that isn't being held, which is your legs and your feet, are going to move convulsively, and that's what caused the ground to be churned up under her. It's not indicative of a general attack, because you wouldn't get churned up ground if two people were punching each other and someone was assaulting the other person. Largely because the person who was being assaulted would be doing everything he possibly could to get away. In order to have churned up ground, the person had to be held in place for at least a period of whatever, 10 or 15 seconds. You wouldn't have that result if the victim were still moving around under her own power. So the other thing that's been talked about is the mitochondrial DNA was taken from a hair that was stuck to the base of Cheri's thumb. This was probably a hair that was taken from the man who was in front of her. He was holding Cheri's arms to her side to keep her from preventing herself from being slashed through the throat. But a person who's being assaulted like that under conditions of life and death tends to have superhuman strength. And at some point, Cheri was apparently able to get her hands free, and that resulted in the cut. It was too late, unfortunately, but that resulted in the cuts in her fingers. It resulted in her being able to pull the hair out of the guy who was in front of her and get his mitochondrial DNA. So the attack in the alley is consistent with two men basically wrestling Cheri to the ground. Cheri realizing before she started screaming that they were not just abducting her, that they intended to actually kill her, and she started to scream, and then her screams were cut off. The other thing that happened with the Bates murder is a Timex watch was found about 10 feet from Cheri's body. I believe that the watch was deliberately left there. I don't believe it was the result of any pulling the watch off of somebody's wrist. Riverside PD took a photograph of the watch that was found at the crime scene. If you look at the photo, the watch is the photo shows the watch time as actually 12:23. I believe that the watch was fixed to be showing a time of 12:22, which is what, and I believe that because that's what Gareth Penn says in his book, and I believe he was one of the conspirators. Um, the um, the Inland, I think it was Inland Empire magazine, showed a picture of a watch that showed a time of 9:07. Renee Modlin, who was the medical examiner, was originally called at 7:15 p.m. He was then told to get ready to come to a crime scene. At 8:30, he was then called again and the police said, "Okay, you can come out to the crime scene now." What that means is the police at the crime scene would have had their photographers taking pictures and the police doing measurements and all of that, and they wouldn't have had that stuff still going on when the medical examiner came in, because the medical examiner was then going to examine the body. The watch was only found 10 feet from the body. Why would they be taking pictures of the watch? After the medical examiner got there, they had already had um, whatever 2 hours or so to take all their photographs. So I don't believe the 907 watch was actually found at the crime scene. I don't think it. I don't know where the watch came from. Riverside PD, when I asked them, said the same thing. The reporter for one of the Riverside newspapers said the same thing. He had never seen the 907 watch. It may have had something to do with the reconstruction. I'm not sure. However, the 907 watch is shown with its face prominent in the photo, just as the 1223 watch is shown. I don't understand why, if you were taking a picture of a watch at a crime scene, you would pose the watch, because there are pictures of the watch at the crime scene with the one of the photographers or the detectives pointing toward where the watch is. And if you look at the watch's band is pointing upward. The face of the watch, I guess, is directly against the on the ground, and what you see is the band curled up. Why would they move the watch if they were taking a picture of the watch in situ at the crime scene? That doesn't make any sense. If you were if you found a an iPhone at a crime scene, you wouldn't the police would not take pictures of the iPhone so that people would know what an iPhone looked like. They would only take pictures of it if there was something unusual about the phone itself. And the same thing with a Timex watch. So Riverside PD took the Timex back to headquarters and took a picture of it, took a close-up picture of it there. There wouldn't be any point in taking a close-up picture of a Timex watch, because Timex watches were everywhere. Probably several of the detectives had Timexes on their wrists. Everyone knows, just as everyone knows what an iPhone looks like, everyone knew what a Timex watch looked like. There would only be two things about the watch that would make them go to the trouble of taking a close-up picture of it. One would be because the watch had paint specks on it, of course, but those don't show up on the photo. So there's a problem right there. The other reason would be if the watch were stopped at a specific time, and just to take note of the fact that the watch was found um, at the crime scene and was stopped. When I talked to Jim Simons of Riverside PD years ago, I guess maybe in 2010, he told me the wording of what he said was, he said, the time on the watch is not significant. Okay, that would seem to suggest to me, in other words, he said the time on the watch does not pertain to the time of the murder. effect. The time on the watch is not to be associated with when the murder happened. Words on, I don't know what his exact wording, and you have to be careful with Riverside PD when you're parsing their exact wording, but it was something like that. The fact that he was talking about the time on the watch suggests to me that the watch was in fact stopped. Again, I believe that the watch was stopped at 12:22, and because of handling, if you look at the photo uh, taken at headquarters, it was stopped at 12:23. So to make a long story short, Cheri Bates intended to go to the Riverside Library the night she was murdered. That's the reason she was basically everything she did from 3:45 on was to do that. It was her intent to get there. She was not seen after 6:15 p.m. That night. That is consistent with her having been abducted prior to getting to the library. No one inside the library. There was one ambiguous statement made by the library staffer. Other than that, no one who was at the library saw Cheri Bates. No one who was outside the library saw Cheri Bates at the library that night. No one saw Cheri Bates trying to start her car. So the account that's given in the confession letter has to be questioned. I don't think it's true. Believe it, as I said, the facts are consistent with Cheri Bates having been abducted circa 6:15 p.m. Her student ID was then used to take books out, which put her in the library. She was then, at 10:30 p.m., she was walked down the alley and murdered by two men who basically grappled with her and lowered her to the ground and cut her throat. And as far as the pulling out of the distributor wire of her car, that might have been done. I don't know when that was done, but it might have been done after Cheri was even murdered because it would have been convenient for her killers to be able to move the car if they so desired. So there wouldn't be any need to pull the distributor wire out prior to her murder. That may have been the last thing that they did before they drove away. Now, if the wire wasn't used to keep Cheri from driving away, why would they pull the wire at all? Well, they would do that for the same reason that they took books out on her student ID, which is they took books out to leave the impression that Cheri had in fact been inside the library that night, and it worked because everybody except myself believes that. Okay, that's number one. Number two, they would pull the distributor wire to suggest that that's the reason Cheri didn't drive away, and it fits with the scenario that's given in the confession letter, which is that her car wouldn't start, and that's because her killer had pulled the distributor wire, and then he turned on her after they were driving to or walking to his car. He turned on her. And when I talked to an administrator at RCC circa 1990, he told me that in 1966 there was actually a parking lot which was down below where the area where the driveway where Cheri was murdered, and that's why there was a fair amount of traffic in that alleyway, and because people would go from, let's say, the Quad building down to the lower area where they would have parked their cars. Okay. Anyway, this this video has been to explain give a walkthrough of what actually happened in Riverside. If people have any specific questions, they can mention them below. I will deal with the other Zodiac crimes with Lake Herman Road, and do like as I said, an informal walkthrough um, in future videos. Having done a video with Ned DeHaan, I thought, well, um, rather than do any sort of like big production, I will just do a basic walkthrough and talk about the Riverside murder. And as I'm aware of some of the more what I would consider to be the ridiculous objections that have been made by people online. Cheri Bates was shy. That's why she wasn't seen inside the library. I don't think Cheri Bates was shy. I think Cheri Bates had made an amazing impact in terms of her visibility and how many friends she had at RCC just in the space of a couple of months. She had friends at the college. People knew who she was. I don't think she was shy. I think she was outgoing. This idea that Cheri would ask her friend just to uh, accompany her on a drive to the library and then drive back. I think that's ridiculous. I think the suggestion that Riverside PD itself made, which was that Cheri ran in at 6 p.m. and grabbed 3 books and took them out and ran back out again. That explains why people didn't see her in the library. That doesn't make sense either, because if you've got a bibliography, as I said, it's 1966. You don't have the libraries would not have computers for decades after that. For I would say like a couple decades, probably till at least the mid to late 1980s. Libraries would not have had computers. If you were looking a book up, you would have to do it with a card catalog. And to look up the books in the card catalog means that you've got to go to the card catalog and pull the drawers out and look up the books, or the book author, or the books by title. So the whole idea, Cheri would not have known which books to take up. So she could not have run in at 6 p.m., grabbed books off the shelf, had them checked out, and run back out again. She would have had to go through the catalog. She would have had to find the books on the shelves. Presumably, if the books were related to a course, the books themselves would have been in demand. She may have had to consult a reference copy of one or more of the books. So the whole idea just doesn't make any sense. And the other problem is, once she leaves the library, then what? I mean, has her car been disabled by then? If it's 6:05 p.m., if it hasn't been, then she just gets in her car and drives away. So if you're making that assumption, then you have to assume that her car had been disabled in the 5 minutes when she ran in, or at least at some time after she arrived at outside the quad building and was away from her car. So if her car is disabled, does that mean that she was trying to start her car from whenever, 6:05 p.m. until almost 10 o'clock or after 10 o'clock? That doesn't make any sense either. She'd have been seen by people. So essentially, if you look at the evidence, the conclusion you're going to come to is Cheri Bates was abducted prior to her murder. Her abductors then used her student ID to take books out to place her in the library. She was walked down after being held for 3 or 4 hours. It's consistent with her stomach contents. She was walked down the alley and murdered. It was very cold-blooded murder. It was not a rage induced attack at all. And it was like a hit. It was like she was Cheri Bates was targeted and very carefully, actually, murdered by her. And there wasn't any excess energy expelled in doing it. So anyway, that's the walkthrough. If people have any responses, they're welcome to post below, and I will probably be doing more videos, on Lake Herman Road and the other Zodiac things, Zodiac events. So thanks very much.